Welcome ghosts and ghouls to another episode of Danica Raven's BiteSize Horror. Today I'll be reading John Charrington's Wedding by E.Nesbit. If you're sitting comfortably, we shall begin. No one ever thought that May Foster would marry John Charrington, but he thought differently, and things which John Charrington intended should happen had a way of happening. He asked her to marry him before he went up to Oxford. She laughed and refused him. He asked her again, next time he came home. Again she laughed, tossed her blonde head, and refused him. A third time he asked her. She said it was becoming a confirmed habit and laughed at him more than ever. John was not the only man who wanted to marry her. She was the belle of our village, and we were all in love with her, more or less. It was a sort of fashion, like heliotrope ties or Inverness capes. Therefore, we were as much annoyed and surprised when John Charrington walked into our little local club. We held it in a loft over the Saddlers, I remember, and invited us all to his wedding. Your wedding? You don't mean it. Who's the happy fair? When's it to be? John Charrington filled his pipe and lighted it before he replied. Then he said, "I'm sorry to deprive you fellows of your only joke, but Miss Foster and I are to be married in September. You don't mean it." He's got the mitten again, and it's turned his head. "No," I said, rising. "I see it's true. Lend me a pistol, someone, or a first-class fare to the other end of nowhere. Charrington has bewitched the only pretty girl in our 20-mile radius. Was it mesmerism or a love potion, Jack?" "Neither, sir. But a gift you'll never have, perseverance, and the best luck a man has had in this world." There was something in his voice that silenced me, and all chaff of the other fellows failed to draw him further. The queer thing about it was that when we congratulated Miss Foster, she blushed and smiled and dimpled, for all the world as though she were in love with him and had been in love with him all the time. Upon my word, I think she had. Women are strange creatures. We were all asked to the wedding in Brixham. Everyone who was anybody knew everybody else who was going. My sisters were, I truly believe, more interested in the trousseau than the bride herself, and I was to be the best man. The coming marriage was much canvassed in the afternoon tea tables and at our local club over the Saddlers, and the question was always asked, does she care for him? I used to ask that question myself in the early days of their engagement, but after a certain evening in August, I never asked it again. I was coming home from the club, through the churchyard. Our church is on a time-grown hill, and the surf about it is so thick and soft that one's footsteps are noiseless. I made no sound as I vaulted the low wall and threaded my way between the tombstones. It was at the same instant that I heard John Charrington's voice and saw her. May was sitting on a low, flat gravestone, her face turned towards the full splendour of the setting sun. Its expression ended, at once and forever, any question of love for him. It was transfigured to a beauty I should not have believed possible, even to that beautiful little face. John lay at her feet, and it was his voice that broke the stillness of the golden August evening. "My dear, I believe I should come back from the dead if you wanted me." I coughed at once to indicate my presence and passed on to the shadow, fully enlightened. The wedding was to be early in September. 2 days before, I had to run up to town on business. The train was late, of course, for we were in the Southern Eastern, and as I stood grumbling with my watch in my hand, Whom should I see but John Charrington and May Foster? They were walking up and down the unfrequented end of the platform, arm in arm, looking into each other's eyes, careless of the sympathetic interest of the porters. Of course, I knew better than to hesitate a moment before hurrying myself into the booking office, and it was not till the train drew up at the platform that I obtrusively passed the pair with my Gladstone and took the corner into the first-class smoking carriage. I did this with a good air of not seeing them as I could assume. I pride myself in my discretion, but if John were travelling alone, I wanted his company, and I had it. "Hello, old man," came his cheery voice as he swung his bag into my carriage. "Here's luck. I was expecting a dull journey." "Where are you off to?" I asked, discretion still bidding me turn my eyes away, though I saw without looking that hers were red-rimmed. "To Old Bransbridge," he answered, shutting the door and leaning out for a last word with his sweetheart. "Oh, I wish you wouldn't go, John," she was saying in a low, earnest voice. "I feel certain something will happen. Do you think I would let anything happen to keep me? And the day after tomorrow, our wedding day." "Don't go," she answered, with a pleading intensity that would have sent my Gladstone onto the platform, and after me it. But she wasn't speaking to me. John Charrington was made differently. He rarely changed his opinion, never his resolutions. He just touched the ungloved hand that lay on the carriage door. "I must, May. The old boys have been awfully good to me, and now he's dying. I must go and see him. But I shall come home in time." The rest of the parting was lost in a whisper, and in the rattling lurch of the starting train. "You're sure to come?" she spoke as the train moved. "Nothing shall keep me," he answered, and we streamed out. After he'd seen the last of the little figure on the platform, he leaned back in his corner and kept silent for a minute. When he spoke, it was to explain to me that his godfather, whose heir he was, lay dying in Fesmarch Place, some 50 miles away, and he had sent for John, and John had felt bound to go. "I shall surely be back tomorrow," he said, "or if not, the day after. Heaps of time. Thank heavens one hasn't to get up in the middle of the night to get married nowadays. But suppose Mr. Branbrig dies?" "Alive or dead, I mean to be married on Thursday," John answered, lighting a cigar and unfolding the Times. At Fesmarch station, we said goodbye, and he got out, and I saw him ride off. I went on to London, where I stayed the night. When I got home the next afternoon, a very wet one by the way, my sister greeted me with, "Where's Mr. Charrington?" "Goodness knows," I answered testily. "Every man since Cain has resented that kind of question." "I thought you might have heard from him," she went on, "as you give him away tomorrow." "Isn't he back?" I asked, for I'd confidently expected to find him at home. "No, Geoffrey." My sister always had a way of jumping to conclusions, especially such conclusions as were least favourable to her fellow creatures. "He has not returned. And what is more, you may depend upon it, he won't. You mark my words, there'll be no wedding tomorrow." My sister Fanny has a power of annoying me which no other human being possesses. "You mark my words," I retorted with asperity. "You'd better give up making such a thunderous idiot of yourself. There'll be more wedding tomorrow than you'll ever take first part in." But I thought I could snarl confidently to my sister. I did not feel so comfortable when late that night, I, standing on the doorstep of John's home, heard that he had not returned. I went home gloomily through the rain. Next morning brought a brilliant blue sky, gold sun, and all such softness of air and beauty of cloud as go to make up a perfect day. I woke with a vague feeling of having gone to bed anxious, and of being rather averse from facing that anxiety in the light of the full wakefulness. With my shaving water came a letter from John, which relieved my mind and sent me up to the Fosters with a light heart. May was in the garden. I saw her blue gown among the hollyhocks, and the lodge gates swung to behind me. So I did not go up to the house, but turned aside down the turfed path. "He's written to you too," she said, without preliminary greeting, when I reached her side. "Yes, I'm to meet him at the station at 3 and come straight on to the church." Her face looked pale, but there was a brightness in her eyes and a softness about the mouth that spoke of renewed happiness. Mr. Branbrigg begged him so to stay another night that he had not the heart to refuse, she went on. "He's so kind, but I do wish he hadn't stayed." I was at the station at 2:30. I felt rather annoyed with John. It seemed a sort of slight to the beautiful girl who loved him, that he should come as if it were out of breath and with dust of travel upon him to take her hand. With some of us, would have given the best years of our lives to take. But when the 3 o'clock train glided in and glided out again, having brought no passengers to our little station, I was more than annoyed. There was no other train for another 35 minutes. I calculated that with as much hurry we might get to the church in time for the ceremony, but oh, what a fool to miss the first train! What other man would have done it? That 35 minutes seemed a year. As I wandered round the station, reading the advertisements and the timetables and the company's bylaws, and getting more and more angry with John Charrington. This confidence in his own power of getting everything he wanted the minute he wanted was leading him too far. I hate waiting. Everyone hates waiting, but I believe I hate it more than anyone else does. The 3:35 was late too, of course. I ground my pipe between my teeth and stamped with impatience as I watched the signals. Click. The signal went down. 5 minutes later, I flung myself into a carriage that I'd bought for John. "Drive to the church," I said, as someone shut the door. "Mr. Charrington hasn't come by this train." Anxiety now replaced anger. What had become of this man? Could he have been taken suddenly ill? I'd never known him to have a day of illness in his life, and even so, he might have telegraphed. Some awful accident must have happened to him. The thought that he'd played her false never, no, not for a moment entered my head. Yes, something terrible had happened to him, and on me lay the task of telling his bride. I almost wished the carriage would upset and break my head so that someone else might tell her. It was 5 minutes to 4 as we drew up to the churchyard. A double row of eagle onlookers lined the path from Lynchgate to porch. I sprang from the carriage and passed up between them. Our gardener had a good front place near the door. I stopped. "Are they still waiting, Biles?" I asked, simply to gain time, for of course I knew they were, by the waiting crowd's attentive attitude. "Waiting, sir?" No, sir." "Why, must be over by now." "Over? Then Mr. Charrington did come?" "To the minute, sir. Must have missed you somehow, and I say, sir," lowering his voice, "I never see Mr. John the least bit so afore, but my opinion is he's had more than a drop. I'd be going too far to say if he's been drinking pretty free. His clothes was all dusty and his face was like a sheet. I tell you, I did not like the look of him at all, and the folk inside are saying all sorts of things. You'll see something's gone very wrong with Mr. John, and he's tried liquor. He looked like a ghost, and he went with his eyes straight afore him, with never a look or a word to none of us. Him, that's always been such a gentleman." I'd never heard Biles make such a long speech. The crowd in the churchyard were talking in whispers and getting ready, with rice and slippers to throw at the bride and groom. The ringers were ready, with their hands on the ropes, to ring out the merry peal as the bride and groom should come out. A murmur from the church announced them. Out they came. Byles was right. John Charrington did not look himself. There was dust on his coat. His hair was disarranged. He seemed to have been in some row, for there was a black mark above his eyebrow. He was deathly pale, but his pallor was not greater than that of the bride, who might have been carved in ivory, dress, veil, orange blossoms, face and all. As they passed out, the ringer stopped. There were 6 of them. And then, on the ears, expecting a gay wedding peal, came a slow tolling of a passing bell. A thrill of horror, as so foolish a jest from the ringers, passed through us all. But the ringers themselves dropped the ropes and fled like rabbits out into the sunlight. The bride shuddered, and the grey shadows cast about her mouth. But the bridegroom led her on down the path, where the people stood with handfuls of rice. But the handfuls were never thrown, and the wedding bell never rang. In vain the ringers were urged to remedy the mistake, but they protested, with many whispered expletives, that they had not rung that bell, that they would see themselves further before they'd ring anything more that day. In a hush, like the hush in a chamber of death, the bridal pair passed into their carriage, and its door slammed behind them. Then the tongues were loosed, a babble of anger, wonder, conjecture from the guests and the spectators. "If I'd seen his condition, sir," said old Foster to me when we drove off, "I would have stretched him on the floor of the church, sir, by heaven I would, before I'd have let him marry my daughter." Then he put his head out of the window. "Drive like hell," he cried to the coachman. "Don't spare the horses." We passed the bride's carriage. I forbore to look at it, and the old Foster turned his head away and swore. We stood in the hall doorway in the blazing afternoon sun. In about half a minute we heard wheels crunching the gravel. When the carriage stopped in front of the steps, old Foster and I ran down. Great heaven! The carriage is empty, and yet... I had the door open in a minute, and this is what I saw. No sign of John Charrington, and of May, his wife, only a huddled heap of white satin, lying half on the floor of the carriage and half on the seat. "I drove straight here, sir," said the coachman, as the bride's father lifted her out. "And I'll swear, no one got out of the carriage." We carried her into the house in her bridal dress and drew back her veil. I saw her face. Shall I ever forget it? White and drawn with agony and horror, bearing such a look of terror as I've never seen since, except in dreams. And her hair, her radiant blonde hair, I tell you, it was white like snow. As we stood, her father and I, half mad with horror, and the mystery of it, a boy came up the avenue. A telegraph boy. They brought the orange envelope to me. I tore it open. John Charrington was thrown from the dog cart on his way to the station at 1:30, killed on the spot. Branbridge, Pheasant Marsh Place. He was married to May Foster in our parish church at 3:30, in presence of half of the parish. I shall be married on Thursday, dead or alive. What had passed in that carriage on homeward drive, no one knows. No one will ever know. Before a week was over, they laid her to rest beside her husband, in the churchyard where they had kept their love trysts. Thus is the story of John Charrington's wedding. A classic Gothic romance story there. If you've got a story of your own, please do send it in to the show. And tune in next week for another episode of Danica Raven's Bite-Size Horror.